Move back, please. These rows are family." The woman in the pearls did not wait to see whether the instruction would be obeyed. She put her hand flat against the shoulder of the red coat and moved it, the way a person moves a chair that has been left in a doorway, and she kept talking while she did it. "The help waits by the vans. Somebody should have told you that." The woman in the red coat stepped back one pace. She did not look at the hand. She did not look at the woman in the pearls. She adjusted her footing on the wet grass and let the space open between herself and the rows of folding chairs, and she said nothing at all. It was a gray Tuesday in the last week of a cold spring, and the grass had been cut that morning. The smell of it sat over the whole section like something that should not have been there, green and bright and out of season, drifting between 200 people who had come to watch a man be buried for the second time. The National Cemetery ran away from them in every direction, in long white rows, headstone after headstone, in ranks so exact that they seemed to turn and align themselves as a person walked past. The new section was at the eastern edge, where the mown ground gave way to a rise of older oaks. Below it, the gravel approach curved up from the main gate, and the caisson stood at the bend of it, with the horses breathing steam into the cold. There were more dress blues in that section than most of the cemetery's staff saw in a month. A battalion had come. They had come from 3 states and from 2 coasts. Some of them still serving, more of them not. And they filled the folding chairs, and then the standing ground behind the chairs, and then the grass beyond that, until the crowd reached the last row of headstones and stopped there out of respect for the men underneath. Staff Sergeant Wes Drager had been buried once already, 5 years earlier, in a small-town cemetery 700 miles west, in a plot his mother had bought in a week when she had not been capable of deciding anything. She had spent 5 years deciding it had been wrong. So this morning he was being brought here, to the rows, to the company he had earned, and the Marine Corps had turned out in numbers to see it done properly. The woman in the red coat stood at the very back. She had a plain coat and plain shoes, and no insignia of any kind. No ribbons, no pin, no cover. Her hair was pulled back without ceremony. She had the look of a person who had driven a long way and had not stopped to make herself presentable at the end of it. And among 200 people in blues and dark suits, she read as exactly what Vivian Braddock had taken her for. Somebody's staff drifted up from the reception hall to see what all the horses were about. Vivian Braddock was 48 years old and had been a colonel's wife for 11 of them, and she had long ago decided that the seating at these things was nobody's job unless she made it hers. She moved along the rows now with her program held against her chest, straightening a chair, touching an elbow, indicating with 2 fingers where a cousin should sit and where a cousin should not. She was not unkind in her own estimation. She was organized. There was a difference, and she had never once had to explain it to anyone whose opinion she valued. The woman in the red coat let her go. And then she did the thing that Hollis Fenn noticed. She turned her head slowly and looked at the tree line at the top of the slope. She held it for 3 seconds. Then she moved her eyes left along the rise, past the oaks, to the low ridge where the older section began, and held that. Then she brought her eyes down the gravel approach to the bend where the caisson stood, and back up again to the trees. She did not look at the grave. 200 people were looking at the grave. It was the only thing there was to look at. The coffin sat under the flag on the lowering device, with the honor guard forming to its left, and the chaplain waiting at its head, and every eye in that section had gone to it, and stayed. Every eye but hers. She was reading the ground, the way a person reads a page, left to right and back again, and Fenn, watching her from the caisson path, with a folded flag under his arm, felt something go cold and quiet in the back of his skull. Hollis Fenn was 66 years old. He had done 31 years in the Marine Corps and finished them as a master gunnery sergeant, and he had spent the 11 years since coordinating honor guards in this cemetery because he had found that he could not stop and did not want to. He had buried more men than he could name. He had stood at the head of more than 900 of these, and in 900 of them, he had watched families and friends and old comrades do what people do at a graveside, which is look at the grave. He had seen 4 people do what the woman in the red coat was doing. All 4 of them had been operators. Everyone. He looked at her for a long moment. She had gone still again, completely still, in the particular way that has nothing to do with age or frailty and everything to do with training. Her weight was already set. Her feet were slightly offset, one a half pace behind the other, so that she could move in any direction without first having to decide to. She was not standing at the back of a funeral. She was holding a position at the back of a funeral, and she had chosen it. And from where she stood, she could see the trees, the ridge, the approach, the gate, and every person in that section. Vivian Braddock came back down the row, saw the red coat still there at the edge of the standing ground, and made a small sound of irritation that carried further than she intended. 200 people were watching a grave. 1 woman was watching the high ground, and the only man in that cemetery who understood why was standing 40 meters away with a folded flag under his arm, and had just realized he did not know her name. The service had not started yet. There were still 15 minutes of people arriving, and in those minutes, an elderly man in a brown suit came up the slope, lost, holding his program in both hands like a hymn book. He stopped in front of the woman in the red coat because she was the last person before the rows, and she looked, to him, like somebody who worked there. "I'm sorry," he said. "My wife's gone on ahead. Where did they put the parking?" 400 meters, straight down the approach, then left at the flagpole, she said. "There's a second lot behind the chapel if the first one's full. Ask for the shuttle at the gatehouse. They'll run you back up." She said it without thinking about it. She said it the way a person gives a distance when giving distances is the ordinary business of their life, flat and exact. And she said the word, approach, the way a person says a word they have said 10,000 times. And the old man thanked her and went off down the gravel with his program still held in both hands. Hollis Fenn had been 6 meters away and had stopped moving entirely. 400 meters, not a quarter mile, not down the road there. 400 meters, straight down the approach. He put the folded flag on the seat of the honor guard's van, and he took a program from the box on the trestle, and he walked up the slope to the back of the standing ground with it, because a man who has spent 31 years reading people knows better than to walk up to somebody like that with a question. "Ma'am," he said, "there's plenty of room up front." She took the program. Her hands were steady, and there were 2 thin white lines across the back of the right one, old ones, the kind that are decades past mattering. "I'm fine at the back," she said. "There's chairs." "I know." She looked at him then, properly, for the first time, and Fenn found himself being read the same way the tree line had been read a few minutes earlier, quickly, completely, and without any hostility whatever. "Thank you, Master Guns." He had not told her that. He was in a gray suit. There was nothing on him that said it. "Been a while since anybody called me that," he said carefully. "It doesn't come off," she said. And then she looked back up at the trees, and the conversation was finished, and Hollis Fenn walked back down the slope with the distinct and unwelcome feeling of a man who has just been outflanked in a graveyard. Wet sand under one knee, a radio that had stopped being a voice and become a hiss, the weight of a man across her back and shoulders, and the specific arithmetic of how many more steps there were, and the way the number would not go down. She let it come, and she let it go. It came often. It had been coming for 5 years, and it came hardest in cold weather and in cut grass, and she had learned a long time ago that fighting it in public was how you lost. She brought her eyes back to the ridgeline. Up in the rows, Vivian Braddock had found Sergeant Kyle Prewitt and taken hold of his sleeve. "Sergeant, I need these rows kept tidy. The family's coming up in a moment, and half of them don't know where to go." She indicated, with 2 fingers, without turning her head, the woman in the red coat at the back of the standing ground. "And that one's been drifting all morning? I don't know who let her up here." Kyle Prewitt was 25. He had been an escort NCO for 11 months, which meant that his entire professional relationship with funerals consisted of doing what he was told by people who seemed to know. And the colonel's wife had spoken to him with total confidence, and total confidence is the most persuasive thing there is when you are 25 and standing in a cemetery in your blues with 200 people watching. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Down at the caisson path, an old master gunnery sergeant who had spent 40 years learning which people stand like, that watched the sergeant start up the slope and knew, with absolute certainty, that he had never once been wrong about it. Vivian Braddock said it to the other 2 spouses first, which was how these things always traveled. "She's with the reception people." Her voice was pitched for 3 and carried for 30. "She's been drifting all morning. Nobody seems to know who let her through." The 2 other women made the small, sympathetic noises that such a statement is designed to collect, and one of them glanced back, and then a man in the row in front glanced back, and then a whole section of the standing ground had turned to look at a woman in a red coat and had formed, in the space of about 9 seconds, a complete and confident opinion of her. She heard every word of it. She was 11 meters away, and the wind was coming down the slope towards her, and she heard all of it, and her expression did not alter by any amount that a camera could have recorded. Sergeant Prewitt arrived in front of her with his hands at his sides. "Ma'am." He was polite. That was the thing that stayed with him afterwards, for years, that he had been polite the whole time, and it had not helped at all. "I'm going to need you behind the last row." She looked at him. She looked at his collar and his ribbons, and the way he had squared himself up, and she saw a young man doing a job he had been given by somebody he had no reason to doubt. "All right," she said. "It's just for the service, ma'am." "All right," she said again, and she moved. Lance Corporal Neil Ashcombe was 20 years old and was standing in the Honor Guard's 2nd rank with a rifle he had cleaned twice that morning, and he watched the whole thing happen from 8 meters away and did not say a word. He had noticed her earlier, without knowing why. Something about the stillness. He had been in the Marine Corps for 14 months, and he did not yet have the vocabulary for what he was looking at. But he had a young man's instinct for when a room has got something wrong, and this section had got something wrong, and he could feel it in his back teeth. He caught her eye as she went past. She gave him nothing. No appeal. No complaint. Nothing that asked him for anything at all. And somehow that was worse than if she had. And Neil Ashcombe looked away first and spent the rest of the morning wishing he had not. Behind the last row, the woman in the red coat stopped and set her feet again, one a half pace behind the other, and returned her eyes to the tree line at the top of the slope. She had been moved off worse ground than this. She had been moved off ground where the moving had been done with a rifle barrel and where the people doing it had considerably better reasons. She had made a study over 16 years of the difference between a fight worth having and a fight that only feels worth having, and she had learned it in places where getting it wrong cost more than pride. This was not a fight worth having. Not today. Not 11 meters from Wes Drager's mother. So she stood behind the last row of headstones, with her hands at her sides and her eyes on the high ground, and she waited. If you have ever watched somebody be moved to the back of a room by people who had no idea who they were talking to, stay with this one and subscribe to the Veteran Vault. The family came up the approach at 10 minutes to 11. Lorna Drager walked at the front of them with a chaplain on one side and a nephew on the other, 58 years old, and gray and upright, and the crowd did the thing crowds do, which is go quiet in a wave that starts at the front and reaches the back 4 seconds later. It reached the back. It reached the last row of headstones, where a woman in a red coat stood watching a mother walk up a gravel path towards a coffin, and for the first time that morning, her eyes came down off the high ground. She watched Lorna Drager for 11 seconds. Then she put her eyes back on the tree line. Vivian Braddock, 3 rows up, saw the red coat still standing where the crowd could see it, and decided that the matter had not been dealt with after all. She has no business anywhere near that flag. She said it to Sergeant Pruitt. She said it in front of 40 people, at the volume of a woman who has never in her adult life had to consider whether she might be wrong in public. And the 40 people heard it, and 4 of them looked at their shoes. "Ma'am, she's behind the last row already." "Then put her past it." Kyle Pruitt would think about the next 8 seconds for the rest of his career. He walked back to the last row. He said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry. I need you further back." And when she did not immediately move, she was not refusing. She was looking at him, working out something about him that he could not see. He put his hand around her upper arm, and he walked her out past the last row of headstones and onto the mown ground beyond it. She let him. She had been trained, a very long time ago, in exactly how much force it would take to make a man that size let go of an arm, and in 3 other methods that did not require force at all, and she used none of them. She walked where his hand took her. She kept her feet under her. She did not stumble, and she did not resist, and she did not make a single sound, and 40 meters of wet grass went by under both of them. And somewhere in those 40 meters, Kyle Pruitt started to feel that something was wrong. It was not anything he could have written down. It was that her arm, under his hand, had not tensed. Not once. He had put hands on people before, drunks outside the gate, a corporal at a ball who had needed to go home. And every one of them had done something with their arm. Pulled, stiffened, gone limp. Something. Hers had done nothing at all. It had stayed exactly as it was, and she had walked at exactly the pace he set, and it had been like moving a person who had already decided, in advance, a long time ago, that being moved by a 25-year-old sergeant was not an event. He let go. She stopped where he stopped. "Thank you, ma'am." "You're all right, Sergeant," she said. And that was worse. He did not know why that was worse, but he walked back to the rows with his ears burning and his hand remembering the shape of her arm. Out past the last row, on the open ground, the woman in the red coat looked at the tree line and the ridge and the gravel approach. The radio, hissing. A voice on it that had been Wes Drager's, saying something that had begun with the word "Mom" and had not finished. Then nothing on the net at all, and 800 meters of open ground between where she was and where he was, and the specific, unbearable clarity of a decision that took her about 1.5 seconds to make. She let it come. She let it go. Hollis Fenn had watched the whole thing from the caisson path, and by the time Pruitt had walked back to the rows, the old master gunnery sergeant was already moving. He did not go to the colonel's wife. He had been 31 years in the Marine Corps, and he knew precisely how far a retired man's opinion traveled with a woman like that, which was not far, and he was not interested in a conversation he could not win in the time available. He went to the sergeant. He came up on Pruitt's shoulder at the end of the last row and stood there, a 66-year-old man in a gray suit, and Pruitt straightened without being told to, because there are men who do that to you, and you never find out how. "Sergeant, who told you to put a hand on her?" "Master Guns." "Who told you?" "The colonel's wife," Pruitt said. "Mrs. Braddock." She said, "Then the colonel's wife has made a mistake," Fenn said, "and you carried it for her. That's the part that's yours." Prewitt's jaw moved. Master Guns, with respect, she's a civilian who wandered up from the... Son. Fenn said it quietly. He was not looking at Prewitt anymore. He was looking out past the last row, at the woman on the open ground, at the offset feet, and the set weight, and the eyes going tree line, ridge, approach, tree line. I have put 940 men and women in this ground. I have stood at the head of every one of them. In 11 years, I have seen 4 people stand at a graveside the way that woman is standing right now, and every single one of them had a jacket in a safe somewhere that neither you nor I will ever be cleared to read. Prewitt looked then. Properly. For the first time. She's watching the trees, he said slowly. She's watching everything, Fenn said. She's been doing it since she got out of the car. She's got the gate, the approach, the ridge, and both flanks. And she picked that spot to do it from before she'd been on the ground 90 seconds. She gave an old man a distance in meters. She called the caisson path the approach. And she made me as a Master Guns in a gray suit from 6 feet away. And I have been out 11 years. Master Guns. You go and stand where you're supposed to stand, Fenn said, and you keep your hands to yourself for the rest of this morning. And when this is over, you are going to want to have been standing very still. He left him there. Then Hollis Fenn walked out past the last row of headstones onto the open ground and stopped a respectful 2 paces off and did not ask her name because he had worked out by then that she was not going to give it and that asking would only make her move. He asked the only question that mattered. Which one was yours? She did not turn her head. For a long moment she did not answer at all, and Fenn stood in the wet grass and let the silence run, because at 66 he had learned that the silence does more work than the question. Draeger, she said. One word. Flat and quiet and absolutely level. And Hollis Fenn, who had been at the briefing for this interment 3 weeks earlier, and who had read the file the way he read all of them, and who knew exactly what had happened on a beach in East Africa in the spring of 2021, and exactly what the citation said about the officer who had gone back. Hollis Fenn went very, very still. He said, "Ma'am." "Don't," she said. "Ma'am, they've got you, standing behind the—" "I know where I'm standing." She turned her head and looked at him, and there was nothing in her face at all. And that was the most frightening thing he had seen in a cemetery in 11 years. His mother is 40 meters from here, about to bury her son for the 2nd time. That is what today is. It is not anything else. Let it be that. Fenn stood there for 3 seconds. Then he said, "Yes, ma'am," because there was nothing else to say to it. And he turned and walked down the slope. He did not go back to the caisson. He walked the length of the gravel approach to the small white marquee where Commander Silas Rothery was checking his order of service, and he took the chaplain by the elbow, and he spoke to him for a little under 1 minute. The chaplain listened. Then he looked up the slope, past the 200 people and the folding chairs and the coffin under the flag, out past the last row of headstones to the open ground, where a woman in a red coat was standing on her own, and something happened in his face. "She's been what?" he said. Fenn told him again. Commander Rothery, 54 years old, 22 of them in the Navy Chaplain Corps, looked down at the order of service in his hands for a long moment. Then he took his pen out of his inside pocket. Behind the last row, Sergeant Kyle Prewitt stood in his blues at the position he had been told to hold, with his hand still remembering the shape of a woman's arm, and understood, not all at once, but arriving, the way cold arrives, that he had been on the wrong side of something all morning, and that he was going to find out what within the hour. What he did not know, and what the 200 people in that section did not know, is what the chaplain had just written on his order of service. Subscribe so that you find out at the same moment the sergeant did. The coast of East Africa, spring 2021. Not 200 hours. She had been 31 years old and a captain, and she had commanded a Marine Raider element of 14 going in over the beach in 2 boats, and the sand had been so fine and so pale that even in the green of the night vision, it had looked like snow. The objective was a walled compound, 1,100 meters inland, at the top of a shallow wadi that ran up from the shore. They had walked it in 51 minutes. Staff Sergeant Wes Drager had walked the left flank, as he always did, 29 years old, 6'1", and possessed of the deeply irritating ability to be cheerful at 2 in the morning in a foreign country with a rifle in his hands. He had said on the way in, over the net, that if this one went clean, he was buying. It went clean for 19 minutes. Then the wadi lit up from the north side, from a position that no one had assessed and no one had seen, and the whole shape of the night changed in about 4 seconds. Captain Iris Denholm made the call to break contact and go back down to the water, because it was the only call there was. She made it in a voice that she barely recognized as her own for how calm it sounded, and the element started back down the wadi in bounds, and somebody had to hold the corner where the wall met the low ground while they did it, because otherwise the fire came straight down the line of the withdrawal, and there would not be an element left to withdraw. Wes Drager took the corner. He did not ask. That was the part she never got past in 5 years. He did not wait to be told, and he did not make a speech, and he did not do anything that anybody would put in a film about it. He simply went left instead of right, and got down behind the corner of that wall, and said one sentence on the net in the same voice he had used to say he was buying. "Go, ma'am, I've got the corner." They went. That was the job. 11 men and 1 corpsman went down 800 meters of open wadi to the beach, because a staff sergeant was holding a corner, and it worked, and every one of them lived, and that is what the corner is for. At the waterline, she turned and counted them, and there were 12, and there should have been 13. The radio had gone to a hiss. She gave the boats to her team leader, and she told him what she was doing, and he argued with her for exactly 2 seconds, which was all the time there was, and then she went back up the wadi on her own. 800 meters, 41 minutes, coming and going. She stopped 3 times. She found him at the corner where he had said he would be, and he had done what he had said he would do, and the position he had held had a great deal of evidence in front of it about how long he had held it. He was not alive. She checked anyway. Twice, because you always check twice. And then she got him up across her back and shoulders in the way you are taught. And that never once resembles the way you are taught when it is real. 800 meters, back down. She stopped 3 times. She never afterwards remembered the second one. There is an arithmetic that happens in a thing like that, and it is the cruelest arithmetic there is, because the number does not go down. You count the meters, and you do the sums, and you know exactly how far there is left, and then you take 40 steps, and you do the sums again, and it has not moved, and the man on your back weighs 210 pounds with his kit, and every one of those pounds is a person who used to say he was buying. She got him to the water. The surf came up over her boots, and then her knees, and the boat crew came in and took the weight off her back, and the weight left her, and she stood in the sea in the dark at 4 in the morning, and found that she could not, for a moment, remember what she was supposed to do next. They gave her a silver star for it, 8 months later, in a room with a flag in it. The citation used the words "at grave risk to her own life," which is what citations say. It did not use the words that mattered. They had given her the call sign 4 years before that, in a different country, and it had stuck for the reason all of them stick, which is that somebody said it once, and everybody else agreed. Still water. Because of how she got in a fight, no faster, no louder, no different at all, she had brought him to the water, and every year since, in cut grass and cold weather, she had understood a little better that bringing him to the water was not the same thing as bringing him home. The service began at 11 o'clock. The honor guard carried him from the caisson to the lowering device in the 7 slow steps that are all any of it comes down to in the end, and 200 people stood, and the wind came down off the oaks and moved the flag on the coffin about an inch. Out past the last row of headstones, on the open ground, the woman in the red coat stood and watched the tree line. Vivian Braddock looked back once during the opening prayer, saw her still standing there in plain sight of the whole section, and leaned across to Sergeant Prewitt with her program against her mouth. She stays behind the last row until this is finished. I don't want her wandering up during the honors. Prewitt did not answer immediately. It was the first time all morning that he had not answered a woman like that immediately, and Hollis Fenn, standing at the end of the honor guard's line with a folded flag under his arm, saw the hesitation and marked it, and thought better of the boy for it than he had thought of him in an hour. "Sergeant?" "Yes, ma'am," Prewitt said. He followed the order. He did not put a hand on anybody. He walked to the end of the last row and stood where he could be seen to be standing there, which was, he understood even at the time, a way of doing a thing while telling yourself you are not doing it. Lance Corporal Neil Ashcombe broke first. He was in the second rank, which meant he had a job for 11 more minutes, and then a rifle volley, and then nothing. And he had spent the whole of the opening prayer thinking about a woman standing on her own, on wet grass 40 meters from everybody else. And when the chaplain moved into the reading, Ashcombe stepped back out of the line, took a program off the trestle, walked out past the last row with 200 people not looking at him, and held it out. "Ma'am." She took it. "Thank you, Lance Corporal." She did not look at his collar. She was still looking up the slope when she said it, and she used his rank, the way people use a word they have said 10,000 times, with no pause in front of it and no care taken over it, the way you say the name of your own street. Neil Ashcombe walked back to his position with the beginning of a very bad feeling. He was 20 years old and 14 months in, and he did not have the vocabulary. But somewhere underneath the place where the vocabulary would eventually go, he had understood something, and it stayed with him through the reading and the hymn and the words about a young man from a small town who had gone where he was sent. Civilians do not do that. Civilians say, "Sir," and they say, "Soldier," and they say, "Excuse me." They do not look at a slope 400 meters away and put the right rank on a lance corporal's collar without checking. He stood in the second rank, with his hands correct on the rifle and his heart going hard, and he waited without knowing what for. Commander Silas Rothery closed the book. He was at the head of the coffin with the flag in front of him, and 200 people in front of that, and the wind had dropped, and the horses at the bend of the approach had gone quiet, and the whole eastern section of that cemetery was as still as it ever gets. "Before the flag is folded," he said, "the family has asked me to read one more name." Nobody moved. It is not an ordinary thing to say at a graveside, and 200 people heard that it was not ordinary. Lorna Drager, in the front row, put her hand over her mouth. 5 years ago, Rothery said, on a beach on the other side of the world, Staff Sergeant Wes Drager held a corner so that 12 men could get to the water. He was not ordered to hold it. He chose it. Every one of those 12 men is alive this morning, and 8 of them are standing in front of me. Somewhere in the middle of the standing ground, a man in his 30s put his head down. When the element reached the water, the chaplain said, they were one short, and their commander went back up 800 meters of open ground, alone, and brought him out, and carried him to the sea. The silence had changed. It had gone from the silence of a funeral to something with weight in it. Mrs. Drager has asked that the name of the officer who brought her son home be read aloud today, in this place, in front of his Marines. He looked down at his order of service, at the line he had written on it in pen 40 minutes earlier. Major Iris Denholm, United States Marine Corps. He paused, and then he said the rest of it, because Hollis Fenn had told him the rest of it. Call sign Stillwater. And 200 heads turned, not all at once. That was the thing nobody who was there ever managed to describe properly afterwards, that it was not all at once. It went through the crowd in a wave, front to back, the way the quiet had gone up the approach an hour earlier, as person after person turned to look for a name at the front and found that everybody in front of them was looking behind them instead. It reached the last row. It reached the open ground, beyond the last row. It stopped at a woman in a plain red coat, standing on her own on wet grass, 40 meters from everybody, with her feet offset and her weight already set, and a program that a lance corporal had brought her, held loosely in one hand. Vivian Braddock turned round with everybody else. Her program was still at her chest. Her face did what a face does when it is looking for the person everybody else is looking at. And then it found her. And then it emptied. It emptied entirely. Every arrangement in it went. The organizing and the certainty and the 11 years of knowing exactly where everyone should sit. And what was left underneath was a 48-year-old woman standing in a cemetery who had, an hour before, put her hand flat on that shoulder and moved it out of the way. Sergeant Kyle Prewitt's face did it in 4 stages, and Neil Ashcombe watched every one of them. Confusion first, a half-second of not understanding, of thinking he had misheard the name or misjudged the direction of the turn. Then disbelief, which was worse, because disbelief is where the arithmetic starts. Then recognition, which arrived in his shoulders before it arrived in his face, and made him straighten so hard and so fast that the man beside him flinched. Then horror. He had walked her out. He had put his hand on her arm and walked her 40 meters across the grass in front of 200 Marines. And she had let him, and she had thanked him, and she had said, "You're all right, Sergeant." The honor guard came to attention. Nobody gave the order. Hollis Fenn always swore afterwards that nobody gave it, and 11 other people said the same thing, and it does not matter because it happened. The whole guard came up together in one sound, boots and rifles, out of the silence, facing a coffin and a mother and a chaplain. And then somebody in the second rank turned his head, and the rest of the section came to attention behind them in a ragged, spreading, entirely unofficial wave. Dress blues and dark suits, and old men in windbreakers, standing up out of the folding chairs in ones and twos, and then all together. Neil Ashcombe's hands were shaking on the rifle. He locked them, and they went on shaking anyway. And Colonel Grant Braddock, 52 years old, who had commanded the battalion that Wes Drager died in, and who had spent 5 years knowing exactly what had happened on that beach and never once meeting the officer who did it, walked out from the front row. He walked the whole length of the aisle, past the chairs, past the standing ground, past the last row of headstones, out onto the open grass in front of 200 people, and he stopped 4 feet in front of a woman in a plain red coat, and he brought his hand up and rendered honors. He held it. She returned it. Then Lorna Drager stood up out of the front row and started across the grass, and she did not walk it the way a colonel walks it. She went straight through the middle of the section with people getting out of her way, and she took hold of the woman in the red coat with both hands, and the whole of that cemetery watched a mother find out, 5 years late, what the name of the person who carried her son to the water had been. The woman his wife had removed from the family rows was standing at the back of the cemetery, being saluted by his own colonel. And the only person in that section who had not moved was Vivian Braddock, still holding her program against her chest in a row of empty chairs. Sergeant Major Otis Vandermeer took Sergeant Prewitt aside afterwards, 40 meters down the approach, by the wheel of the caisson. It did not last long. It never does. Vandermeer was 47 and had a voice he had not needed to raise since about 2011. And what he said to Kyle Prewitt took under 2 minutes and left the young sergeant standing very straight and very white with his cover in his hands. Colonel Braddock spoke to his wife by the cars. He did not raise his voice either. That was the part that people who saw it remembered, that a man stood in a car park in his blues and spoke quietly to his wife for 4 minutes, and that she stood there and took it with her chin up and her program still in her hand, and that at no point did he say anything that anyone standing 10 feet away could hear. Some things do not need volume. He had spent 5 years going to a beach in his head, and this morning his wife had put her hand on the person who went there in reality and moved her out of the way of the family rose. The Marine Corps has a great many mechanisms for this sort of thing, and Otis Vandermeer had already started 3 of them by the time the crowd began to thin. Major Iris Denholm stopped all of them with one sentence. "Nothing happens to the sergeant." Vandermeer looked at her. "Ma'am, he put hands on you in front of the guard." He was doing exactly what he was told by a colonel's wife, who spoke to him with complete confidence, she said. And he is 25. If we ended careers over that, we would not have a Marine Corps left. He will remember this morning until he dies. That is the whole of the punishment, and it is more than enough. And Mrs. Braddock? Is somebody else's conversation, Denholm said, and I am not going to have it at West Drager's grave. If somebody once did that for you, took the thing they were entitled to and set it down because a family was standing there, subscribe to the veteran vault and let this one find the people who need it. The crowd was gone by 12:30. The chairs went into a van, and the horses went down the approach, and the section emptied the way those sections always empty, in 2s and 3s, with people stopping to touch the top of a headstone that was nothing to do with them. Major Iris Denholm stayed. She stood in front of the new stone for a long time. The lettering was crisp and pale, and would not stay that way. Around her the rows ran off in every direction, rank after rank, exact, aligned, turning as she moved. Lorna Drager came back up the slope and stood beside her, and the 2 of them looked at it together for a while without saying anything. "You never wrote," Lorna said. It was not an accusation. She had thought about how to say it for the whole walk up. "No. 5 years. I know." Lorna Drager looked at the stone. Was it quick? And Denholm, who had answered that question wrongly to other mothers, when she was young enough to think a kind lie was a kindness, told her the truth, in the order it happened, in meters and minutes. Because the truth is the only thing anybody ever actually wants at a graveside, even when they say otherwise. She told her about the corner, and about the sentence he had said on the net, which was, "Go, ma'am, I've got the corner," and how it had been said in exactly the voice he had used 40 minutes earlier to say he was buying. She told her about the 800 meters and the 41 minutes, and the 3 stops. "I want you to know something," Denholm said, and it was the only moment in that entire morning when her voice did anything at all. "I carried him to the water. People say it to me like it is the same thing as saving him. It is not the same thing. I have never once been able to make it be the same thing." Lorna Drager took her hand. "You brought him to me," she said. "Both times." Down at the bend of the approach, Sergeant Kyle Prewitt was waiting with his cover in his hands. He had been waiting for 40 minutes. He was going to wait as long as it took, and when she came down the gravel he came to attention and got about 4 words into what he had spent 40 minutes preparing before it came apart on him. "Ma'am, I want to apologize for—" "Sergeant," he stopped. "Look at me." He did. "You were told to do a thing by somebody you had no reason to doubt, and you did it politely. And when you started to think it was wrong, you slowed down. I watched you slow down, That part is yours, and you should keep it. Ma'am, Next time you slow down sooner, Major Denholm said. That is the whole lesson. There is no more of it than that. She got into her car and drove 6 hours home. Behind her, in the eastern section, the light came off the oaks and moved across 941 white stones in their exact and endless rows, and on one of them, still crisp, still pale, was the name of a staff sergeant who had gone left instead of right at a wall in the dark, and had never once, in the whole of his short and cheerful life, needed anybody to tell him what a corner was for. Some warriors fade quietly into the years, but the valor never leaves them. Honor the ones who carry it in silence. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to the Veteran Vault for more.